Hello and welcome to the Common Weal Policy Podcast. I'm Craig Dalziel, the Head of Policy and Research at Common Weal, and this week I'm joined by our guest Anthony Salamone, the Managing Director of the European Merchants Advocacy Group. Hello Anthony, how are you doing?
Great, Craig, how are you?
I'm doing well, always enjoying these podcasts. Now, the reason we've got you on today is to talk about a paper you published this year, looking at the prospects of Scotland rejoining the EU as an independent nation. I have to say I was very impressed with the paper when I read it. It struck me as the kind of deep detail work that we should be seeing more of when we're talking about the prospects of Scottish independence. But can you tell us just what your motivation was for writing the paper and you know, how you came about doing it?
Sure, Craig. Well, first off, thanks very much for having me. Really looking forward to our discussion. Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I mean, why I want to write Scotland's EU Blueprint, well, you know, I think that EU membership is such an important part of our public conversation when it comes to independent Scotland's relationship with the rest of Europe. And obviously with the UK now having regrettably left the European Union. And I know that, you know, there's a lot of talk, a lot of discussion. It's a big part of the debate, but I think that it's really quite crucial that we really think through some of the detail, as you mentioned, of what it would really take for Scotland, not just to join the European Union, and that's very important, but how could Scotland join the European Union in a way that would make it set up to be successful as an EU member state? Because, you know, it's perfectly possible to join the EU and to be a member state, and particularly to be a smaller member state as Scotland would be. But you're not guaranteed to be a successful one. You know, you can be abrasive like the UK, for instance, of course, or you can be much more constructive like Ireland or Finland. And I think that the main point of the blueprint is to try to work through, really from start to finish, how I see it, of how Scotland could join the EU every step of the way along that process, and how to go through each of those steps in a way that Scotland would be best set up to be successful.
Yeah, it really does strike me that the UK never really had that integrative, you know, positive membership. Even when it was a membership, it was always kind of one foot in the door and looking to see what it could get out of that. And whenever I travelled to virtually any other country in the EU, the feel of the place was different because of that.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. I mean, you know, a big part of the report, particularly in the beginning, I talk about is it's important to think about why would you want to be in the European Union? You know, and I think, you know, so much of the UK debate, the London focused debate, is on economics and trade, and those are important things for sure. But being part of the European Union is much larger than that. It's also about values and what kind of Europe you want to be part of and also contribute to. And I think that, you know, when you look at countries that are similar to Scotland in size who are successful in the European Union, like Finland, like Ireland, and others, they all are with the program on what the European Union is about, how they see themselves in the Union, and what they get from it and what they give to it.
So let's start off with a few topics that is the kind of thing that you often hear in the Scottish debate whenever the EU is mentioned. Let's talk about maybe some of the myths that have grown up, and especially on social media, but in the general discourse in Scotland. So the first one that always comes up when we talk about Scotland potentially joining the EU is you will be at the back of the queue. You know, what does that actually mean? What is the reality of that?
I think it's really important, as you say, to demystify some of these themes which seem to come up all the time. You know, be very straightforward. There is no queue. You know, obviously, any European state can apply to join the European Union. The vast majority of countries in Europe, as the EU defines Europe, have either already joined the EU or have decided not to be in the EU, like Switzerland, for instance. And then, you know, the main countries that are sort of left, as it were, are the Western Balkans, and most of them are. Some have joined, like Croatia, Slovenia. Others are in the process of joining the European Union. But so it's open to any European state, and each application proceeds at its own pace. So, you know, if you are a country which is, you know, is ready to join the EU faster, then you'll join faster. If you're going to take longer, then you'll take longer. And it's as simple as that. There's no order of priority. The European Commission and the European Union are used to multitasking and dealing with more than one thing at once, and they can certainly add a potential accession process for an independent Scotland, just as they would for anything else that happens in the European Union. You know, the key point is is how ready are you? And obviously Scotland would be in a fundamentally different position from any other country which has sought to join the European Union before, which in many ways would make the accession process faster. At the same time, however, the accession process is a process which has to be followed, and that means it might take a bit longer than some people might expect.
So it's just really not the case that Scotland could find itself in the position of, right, you've met all the criteria, you're ready to go, but oh, sorry, Turkey hasn't joined yet, so you'll just have to wait.
No, there'll be nothing like that at all. No, it's entirely based on, Scotland applying, going through the accession process, being ready to join, and then joining whenever it's ready. There's no question of waiting. And I suppose that there is a fair, so first of all, there's the myth about there's a queue. That's one point, which I think we've tried to debunk. The second, which you might have alluded to, is the idea that in previous rounds of enlargement, where countries joining the European Union, they sort of joined in groups. For instance, Austria, Sweden, and Finland in 1995, and so you might sort of group countries together, and if Scotland were sort of ready, almost basically ready to join, you might sort of wait until a Western Balkan country was ready, and sort of you could both join at the same time. I don't think so. I think the EU is done with that. I think we're now at the phase where, unless two countries happened to be ready at the same time, within a few weeks of each other, they might join together. But otherwise, from now on, each country will join the European Union one at a time.
Yeah, so it'll be coincidence rather than design.
Yes.
I guess the other big myth is the idea that Scotland could, meet all of the criteria, but then another country, Spain is given as the example, but potentially it could be any country in the EU, could just say no, could apply a veto and say, Scotland, you are not joining. What's the? I mean, is that something that could hypothetically happen? But then, what is the actual scenario or the probability of that happening?
Well, it's possible, but I don't think it's likely at all. So what we're talking about here are decisions in the EU Council, the Council of Ministers. That's the body of the European Union, which brings together all the EU member states and takes decisions on enlargement. Enlargement is one of the few areas left in the European Union where the EU Council really is in the driving seat, for instance, instead of the European Commission. And enlargement is also one of the few areas left in EU policymaking where unanimity is required in the Council, basically at every stage. It's one of the few areas left. Most areas of EU policymaking operates on what's called the qualified majority voting system, where not every country has to agree on things, but enlargement is required. So that means at every stage of the accession process, from when Scotland would submit its letter to join the European Union through to opening and closing the different chapters of the accession process to different areas that you negotiate on, through to deciding when that's over, and so on. Every single decision in the Council needs to be taken by unanimity, which means that every single member state would need to agree. So at any of those points, yes, if a member state didn't vote to move things forward, I suppose you could consider that a veto. Now, I still think that we're talking about hypothetical circumstances, so we'd have to see how things went, but I think that's relatively unlikely, sure. Because if we've gotten to a point where, first of all, if the member states agreed that they wanted to accept Scotland's application, which I think they would, then it's just a question of going through the negotiation process. But in terms of a country, for instance, like Spain or France, saying, we're going to veto Scotland's application to join the EU because we don't want a country which has just become independent from another state joining the EU, no, I don't think that's likely at all. The main point will just be to look at what Scotland's relationship with the rest of the UK and how did the independence process happen. I think the main point is that all the countries in the European Union will be looking to see what is the relationship between Scotland and the UK. Was the UK endorse or supportive of the independence referendum, for instance? How do the negotiations go between the UK and Scotland for Scotland to become independent? And then what view the UK government takes in terms of recognizing Scotland as an independent state. Those are the things that will matter, but they'll matter for every EU member state, not just Spain.
It does strike me that while the EU is a body that does kind of pride itself in its rules and process, there will still likely be some element of politics and diplomacy in this.
Absolutely, for sure. The EU is an intriguing combination of a rules-based system plus the politics added, yes. So, I think when we start to think about the political dimensions, it underlines the importance for Scotland to cultivate good relationships with all of the EU member states, sort of almost in advance of its accession process, particularly during the transition to independence, to have a good bilateral relations with all of the EU member states, but particularly the ones that are more important in terms of decision making. So that would mainly be France and Germany in the first instance, and then you can work your way down to Italy, Spain, and Poland, and then countries that are important for Scotland in terms of our own links. So Ireland, for instance, you can't, depends on what you have in the way of diplomatic resource, but you may not be able to invest in all of the relationships equally. Yes, that's quite crucial. And I think the most important thing is France and Germany. If France and Germany are agreed that Scotland should join the European Union and Scotland should join the European Union in an expeditious way, insofar as an expeditious way as possible, then I think that makes a big difference to what the other member states decide what position they decide to take.
Yeah. So let's talk a wee bit about the process as we go. We've become independent. We've started to look at the process of joining. Now, some countries have, as you mentioned, had a fairly rapid entry into the EU. Some have spent years trying to converge and are not there yet. Some have kind of more or less stalled, or even in the case of countries like Iceland, simply abandoned the process altogether. What are Scotland's advantages here in terms of where do we start and how far do we need to go to become compliant for membership?
Yeah, well, Scotland's in a very unique position, of course, isn't it? Having been part of the European Union for over 46 years, first off, but secondly, as part of another EU member state, or a larger EU member state, depending on how you think of it. I think that's the crucial difference. So yes, Scotland was previously in the European Union, and therefore, for instance, applied the acquis communautaire, which is the EU's collection of rules and laws and policies and so on. And then that's great. That makes a big difference. That means that in those relative areas that you're much more likely to already be in position to satisfy the requirements to become a member state. But then, of course, there are all those other areas where sort of the UK level or UK institutions were responsible for ensuring the UK's and therefore Scotland's adherence to the acquis, and those are areas where, of course, it would take more time because as part of the process of independence, becoming an independent state, state institutions will have to be created, and those institutions will be the ones to fulfill those particular aspects of what it would take to join the EU. So I think I've said in the paper, and I agree with this, that Scotland would probably be the most qualified country ever to seek to apply to join the European Union. That being said, as I set out in the report, there is a process to be followed of applying and working with the Commission, screening Scotland's existing laws and policies to see how they accord with the acquis, negotiating all of the different chapters of the accession treaty and so on. And that process inevitably takes time. The EU is not an extremely fast-moving entity. And of course, I think that there are two key points about that, or three, in fact. One is that, it will take several years. As I put out in the report, it would probably take about 4 to 5 years for Scotland to join the European Union. But that does not mean that it was an extremely difficult process or challenging or waiting. It's not about waiting. It's about going through all of the modalities that are required, and just frankly, they take time. Even if negotiations went at light speed, it's extremely difficult to see them taking less than a year. And then the other most important part would be ratifying the treaty when everything's done. That would probably take about a year. Again, might it be faster? Yes, possibly, but it's not reasonably likely to think so, and it's important to be realistic. There's that. But secondly, it's important that Scotland is fully ready to join the European Union. We don't want to rush this. This is, if Scotland has decided to join the EU, then we want to do it in a way that ensures that the EU is ready and Scotland is ready, and that Scotland is ready to take on both the responsibilities and the rights of being an EU member state on day one of membership. And that's really important. And that leads me to my third point, is that the accession process is fundamentally meant to be a constructive one. This is about the European Commission and the member states working with, in this case, Scotland, working with Scotland to make sure that it's best placed to join the EU and be successful. It's really crucial that we will go into the negotiations and all the preparations with that in mind. This is about working together to find, to agree the solution that will lead to Scotland joining the European Union, and really sort of eject the UK approach of confrontation and aberration and grievance, and focus much more on how to be constructive and find a viable pathway for Scotland both to join the EU and be successful.
Yeah, and that constructive approach is something that, well, I've got relatively little knowledge on the detailed work for other countries' journeys, and I do look at some of the countries, like especially the post-Soviet countries, who in some aspects started out even maybe slightly ahead of Scotland, where in the sense that Scotland doesn't have a central bank, so would have to build one from scratch, whereas a lot of these countries had federal banks within the Soviet Union and could turn them into something like a central bank. But they also had to do a lot of work to change their entire economy and economic structure, and I know that the EU played a big role in supporting that transition.
Yes, certainly. The countries of Central and Eastern Europe, it was a big change for the European on many levels. One, as you mentioned, that these countries were reorienting themselves into, a free market capitalism, and the EU's support for that. The huge amounts of EU funding and investments in those countries generally, particularly for Poland and for Hungary. But also because it changed the nature of the European Union. We went from an EU of 12 and 15 member states through to 24, 27, 28, now back to 27. And that changed the character of how the EU worked. It meant that the EU Council was much bigger in terms of ministers. It means that there are more European commissioners, and there's still debate about that. It also means that the European Parliament, first of all, increased, but secondly, that different EU member states the existing member states would have proportionally fewer seats than they did before. So no, it was a big change for the EU on multiple levels, for the institutions of the European Union, for those countries that were already in the EU, and then for those countries that were joining. And sure, yes, of course, countries like Poland or Hungary, they had institutions of the state, which Scotland does not, the central bank being one, sure. And that definitely does matter. But also Scotland is in a different position in that, first of all, Scotland is a fully, as we would so-called advanced democracy. Scotland already is a free market economy, and those things will make the EU accession process much faster than any of the countries of Central and Eastern Europe at the time which they decided to join the European Union.
Another thing I'd like to come on, and you hinted a little bit at that in your response there. Can we talk about what Scotland's membership as an independent country would look like compared to our previous membership as part of the UK? I mean, what would be particularly noticeably different for Scotland when we rejoin?
Well, I think there are a couple of interesting dimensions to this. The top level, the most obvious, of course, is the difference in political representation, of course, right? So that, independent Scotland and the European Union would have a seat at both the European Council, which is all the heads of governments, the prime ministers and presidents, and also in the EU Council, which is the meetings of all the various ministers. So Scotland would be there in its own right. Scotland would have more members of the European Parliament, and we last had 6. I'd expect we'd have more like 14 as an independent EU member state. And also a European commissioner, for instance, and of course, European commissioners don't act on behalf of the countries they come from. They act in the European interest, but nevertheless, it's still a way of ensuring that the Scottish views in a generalized sense are within the European Commission at the top table of the College of Commissioners. So there's that. The political representation for Scotland would be much greater. It would be easier for the Scottish government and also the Scottish Parliament to ensure that Scotland's interests were advocated directly in the European Union and not filtered through the UK, or indeed diluted by the UK's very negative approach sometimes to the European Union. So that's that political representation. Secondly, that Scotland will be involved in formulating EU policies. That there would be scope to try and ensure that they better reflect Scotland's interests. And again, I'm not saying you have a guarantee of getting everything you want. I mean, no multilateral organization works that way. But when it comes to areas which are more challenging for Scotland, so for instance, in the common fisheries policy, it doesn't mean that Scotland's going to get everything at once. But of course, if you're an EU member state seeking to shape the common fisheries policy in a particular way, then yes, you are more likely to be successful than if your interests are being filtered through a larger member state, and that larger member state is, for instance, less interested in that outcome than you are. Sure, there's that. And then, generally speaking about how you want to, what you're looking to achieve in the EU and how you go about achieving it. So, for instance, if you are very committed, as the current Scottish political debate is, to addressing climate emergency in a meaningful way, then you can work with other member states, for instance, who share similar views to try to advocate your position. So it just fundamentally changes the dynamic about how you do things, how you get things done, and hopefully the benefits that you accrue as a result.
So we've had quite a positive picture there of a Scotland that wants to be a front and centre member, is meeting all the criteria and is getting back in as quickly as is reasonably possible. But can we talk maybe about some of the barriers? We can start with the obvious one. What is the impact of Brexit in all this? What could that make Scotland's re-entry into the EU harder?
Well, I think it depends on the timeline. So first off, there is an important consequence of Brexit, which means that since the UK is no longer a member state of the European Union, in contrast to 2014, the UK will have no influence on Scotland's EU accession process. It's only up to member states to decide, and the UK is not a member state. So, whatever the UK government says for now and for forever about Scotland joining the European Union will have no voice in that. So that's an important distinction from before. But second, in terms of challenges, well, it's useful to think of it, to my mind anyway, in terms of the big three criteria to join the EU. Now, of course, these are the Copenhagen criteria. They're somewhat infamous, but they're really not that complicated. There are three of them. It's the political criterion, the economic one, and the institutional one. So, and thinking about how Scotland prepared on those three core aspects. Now, I think on the first two, Scotland is extremely well prepared. So political, that means, do you have a democracy? Do you have, a good rule of law? Do you have respect for human rights, and so on? And I think that, Scotland will do extremely well in that. Secondly, is the economic one, is, how well prepared is your economy to be part of the EU single market, and so on. Well, obviously, Scotland was part of the single market, so quite well prepared. But then we get to the third one, which is the institutional one. And that is, do you have all the institutions that you need to fulfill the acquis and to implement all the rights and obligations of EU membership? And that is the space where Scotland would need to do the most in the way of preparation. Connected to what I was saying before about those institutions which are currently UK level institutions that Scotland would have to replicate. Those are areas where we talk about areas which are reserved to the UK state. Those are areas where it will take some time and effort for Scotland to prepare itself, regardless of how long the negotiations with the EU take. And that's an area where definitely work will be required. But of course, in terms of how that affects Scotland's EU membership application, well, that's really largely down to us as to how wisely we use the period of the transition to independence to build those institutions, and the manner in which we build those institutions to ensure that as they're being created, that they would be suitable for the requirements of EU membership. Not that we'd create them in a way that was not suitable for EU membership and then have to change them. So that definitely would be something which I think is really important to keep in mind. To if there is a consensus, which of course I hope there would be, to join the European Union, we could talk about how you might sort of agree that consensus. That if you're going into building a state, a Scottish state, and that EU membership is part of that state, that you will build that state accordingly. I think that would be a very smart way to do things, which would make the EU accession process faster, but also ensure that Scotland could, fully integrate into the European Union in a much more meaningful way.
And on the flip side of that, is it possible that Scotland could effectively make some of these barriers for itself? I mean, we've talked about building our institutions to be compliant with the EU process, but obviously we could decide to not do that. We could decide to follow the UK down its global Britain Brexit path and remain compliant with them, and that could take us away from the EU. But another thing that was often brought up pre-2016, certainly in the 2014 campaign, was if Scotland rejoins the EU, you wouldn't get any of the UK's opt-outs and vetoes. Could we go to the EU negotiators and say, well, can we have these opt-outs and vetoes that we used to enjoy as part of the UK?
Well, I think it's, Scotland is very different from the rest of the UK, and I think that's obvious. But it's not just in terms of politics, but also in terms of, frankly, in terms of size, in terms of weight. Of course, it's clear to say that the UK is larger economically and was more influential politically as one of the big three EU member states than Scotland would be, as a smaller country and relatively less influential. But that doesn't mean that Scotland couldn't be influential, and doesn't mean that Scotland couldn't be successful. But it means that in order to be successful, you need to approach everything you do in a way which recognizes the realities of your own position and of the European Union. So that's my long way of saying that when it comes to the negotiations, It's perfectly reasonable, even for a country of Scotland's size, to have specific asks, to have specific requirements saying, we really need this particular thing to be agreed as part of our accession, even though it's different from the rest, but because it's something that is politically sensitive for us, it's perfectly possible to have those. But you can have very many of them. They need to be very focused, and they need to be attuned to the political realities in Brussels, so that you don't go in there and, for instance, ask for opt-outs that you're not going to get, because then you will have wasted your political capital on something which ultimately didn't result for you. So no, I think it's perfectly possible to have a core number of priorities which are maybe different from what the European Union would be suggesting as the default that Scotland could have, but they have to be ones that are going to actually be deliverable. So when it comes to opt-outs generally, I think that now that the UK has left the EU, in my own view, I think the era of individual treaty level opt-outs for member states is over. I really don't think that the European Union is going to be writing in specific treaty level, so extremely constitutional primary level opt-outs for countries. For instance, obviously on the euro, obviously the UK and Denmark are the two EU member states, or were the two EU member states that had opt-outs. It looks really strange now that Denmark is the only country in the European Union that has an opt-out from the euro. That sort of thing just looks bizarre. So I really don't see that happening. But more to the point, it gets to the question of, what do opt-outs really mean? Well, opt-outs are examples of you saying, are symbols of failure, that we couldn't agree on a process, we couldn't find a way forward, and so we need opt-outs. And that's not the way to be a constructive and effective member state, to try to be seeking opt-outs on all these various issues, particularly if you're a European small state seeking to be agile and networked and active in the European Union. It's not a question of that. It's a question of actually saying, how can we be part of as many EU programs and initiatives as an EU member state as we can, and to network within them as much as we can, and work within all of them to try to achieve our interests. So just one point on that I would say is that I don't think the opt-outs are going to be much of a thing, but I do think there is definitely scope within the European Union to have an arrangement for Scotland with respect to Schengen, the Schengen area. This is if Scotland wants to maintain a renewed common travel area between Ireland and the rest of the UK and Scotland, I do think that the European Union would be willing to agree on that, sure. But in terms of opt-outs as a general principle, no, I don't see that happening, and I certainly don't see a treaty-level opt-out for Scotland on the euro.
And so we may as well pick that one up as well. So there wouldn't be an opt-out on the euro, but is that the same as saying that Scotland will be compelled to join the euro as soon as is practically possible, day one of EU membership, or as soon as possible thereafter?
Well, this is one of those questions where it's important to have a compelling short answer. It's kind of yes or no. And so if you had to boil it down, the short answer is no. No, Scotland would not be compelled to join the euro. But then if you want to unpack that to a greater level of depth, it's that no, Scotland would not be forced to join the euro, not by the EU member states, not by the European Commission. It would be entirely up to Scotland. But there would be a commitment in there, a general commitment without a time horizon, saying that we are committing to eventually joining the euro. And you can make that 10 years, or you can make that 100 years. That's entirely up to you. And so, but that general commitment would be there, sure. But then it's important to take it to another level, as I write in the report and elsewhere. It's to have a really full debate, and this should be part of the wider independence conversation about what currency Scotland should have. And of course there's the question between a Scots pound and between sticking with sterling in some dimension, sure. But I really think that the euro needs to be a broader, be part of that conversation as well. It's strange that our debate has found itself to a place where the default question is, would we be forced to join the euro? And that's pretty odd, particularly when we consider that member states that Scotland looks to, Ireland is as one country that Scotland looks to often for inspiration, has been part of the euro for over 20 years. The vast majority of EU member states are in the euro, and the remainder, probably in time will join the euro. And that links to core questions about, as I mentioned before, about what kind of member state you want to be. If you want to be influential, then your position relative to the eurozone makes a big difference, because that is a core part of the European Union. And one of the biggest developments in the European Union is political integration. And of course, that happens around and within the eurozone. And so, if you're talking about the long term, I'm saying if you're looking, it's important to have a long-term horizon. If you're looking to, 10 or 15 years after having joined the EU for Scotland, where would Scotland be? How influential would it be? It makes a big difference whether or not Scotland is in the euro. And the longer you are not in the Eurozone, the less influential you'll be, in short.
I guess the final thing we can really talk about in terms of potential barriers or difficulties that are sometimes mentioned. This one comes more from the EU side. This is the standing rule around the Stability and Growth Pact and the controls over finances and budgets and budget deficits. I mean, is this a barrier to Scotland's entry into the EU? Would it be a case of you must have your budget deficit down below X% before you're allowed to join, or is it a bit more complicated than that?
I think when it comes to the finance and budgetary questions, that there is always flexibility. There's flexibility for countries which are seeking to join the European Union, and frankly, there's flexibility for countries which are already in the European Union who are not in accord with the various EU fiscal rules. I mean, I can't remember exactly, but I believe 25 of the 27 EU member states have at one time or another not adhered to the requirements of the Stability and Growth Pact as judged by the European Commission. So clearly this is not a thing where, you can't join the EU or be part of the EU if you are meeting all the targets that are set out. It's a question of negotiation. And that gets down to the fundamental point that Scotland will be in a particular position, and it will be different to some of those other countries we talked about earlier that were seeking to join the EU. Scotland will be founding a state. That obviously that will have an impact on the fiscal position of the Scottish state, both in terms of how much public spending is going on, but also maybe some short-term dynamics which may not exist in the longer term, and that would create circumstances where maybe Scotland wouldn't as easily meet some of the targets that are required in terms of a percentage of budget debt or deficit. And the most important thing about that is to go to the European Union with a cogent, clear, and understandable case, saying, well, here are our circumstances. We need some sort of transition period for on the fiscal criteria, for instance. Here are our reasons why. If you go to the EU and you explain that, I'm very confident that the European Union would be willing to work with that and find a solution for Scotland that, first of all, would allow Scotland to join the EU and then manage things afterwards. Naturally, obviously, the present, the contemporary circumstances when Scotland was applying would make a big difference. And of course, we're in the present situation of the coronavirus pandemic, where the vast majority of EU fiscal rules have been thrown out the window. And I think that, and that kind of climate as well, provided Scotland, for instance, were to apply to join the European Union in the relatively near future, there's much less of an emphasis on these kinds of fiscal targets across the EU institutions and all of the member states. And that might make this issue less dramatic than it could have been before.
And of course, we've got the climate emergency looming as well, and everybody, every country in the world now is faced with creating their version of a Green New Deal, and we're all working to the same timelines, but with similar relative budgets on this. It's going to involve a lot of spending.
Yes, I think it's perfectly possible that in light of that, the European Union may reevaluate its fiscal governance generally.
So, Anthony Salamone, it has been absolutely fascinating talking to you. It's been really great to have you on the podcast. Just as we wrap up, I'd like to say, as we always do, that Common Weal as an organisation, we are entirely funded by folk like our listeners who give us a donation of £5 or £10 a month. I know things are very difficult right now, but if any of you out there are in a position to help us out, to help our campaigns and our own policy work, then it's very, very much appreciated. I should also say that after a lot of work from people in the background, our online shop is back up and running today, and will be up and running until the 14th of December. So if any of you are looking for a book such as How to Start a New Country, our blueprint on how we actually build all the institutions that we will need as an independent state, you can find it on our website. I'll have links in the description. Anthony Salamone, again, thank you very much for coming onto the podcast, and for everyone out there, we'll see you all next week.